Loibner-Waitkus.
All right, let's do The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. I will be honest when I do these videos on what I think of stories, and this is not my favorite. I think it's a little melodramatic, a little over the top. I get its impact. I get why students like it. I get why it's one of the most commonly taught short stories in literature classes. And part of it may have to do with one of the audio recording I listened to of it when I'm reviewing it between readings is by a woman who's has a seemingly fake British accent, and this is an American story, and she's way over the top in her reading, so that may pepper a little bit my thoughts on the story. First off, let's go over the title. When Charlotte Perkins Gilman wrote it, it was published in 1892. Charlotte Perkins Gilman was born in 1860 and died in 1935. When she wrote it, wallpaper was two words that was hyphenated. In fact, teenager, similar word. We lost the hyphen a few years ago. Same thing with wallpaper, further back in time. So if you want to write on this, which I do not mind, and it is probably the most commonly written about short story that we do in this class, you may want to search it both ways. I would prefer when you use it in your paper to type it with the hyphen as it's indicated in our textbook, considering that's going to be the text that you're most likely to quote. Now, Charlotte Perkins Gilman is much like Shirley Jackson, who wrote The Lottery. Name another story by Shirley Jackson. Exactly. She pretty much had one story that anybody pays any attention to, and that's how Charlotte Perkins Gilman is. This was really her big story, but it made a big impact, which we're going to get to in a second. Before we start discussing that, I want to discuss the type of the point of view from which it's told and the type of story. We have two points of view, general points of view that are used in short stories: first person and third person. With third person, it means that the narrator is not a person in the story, and we can generally trust that. With modern American lit, and we tend to trust first person too, but with modern American lit and the things that we read, anytime it's in the first person, you have to remember this is a human being telling the story in terms of the story, and is in the story, and is therefore flawed. It would be like, if you call a friend and you have two friends, and one tells you something that happened and another tells you something that happened. Those may vary because they're going to be seen filtered through what they see, and so when something is first person, it's filtered through what they see. Two sort of extreme examples, but perfect examples of how this can be problematic, is Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart, where you have a narrator who is insane, and I had to start the video over in a way to figure out how I was going to term this and not offend anybody, but there's really no way around it. William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, one of the narrators is Benji. He uses three, and one of whom is a child named Benji who is mentally retarded. Again, I could say special needs or whatever, but I mean, we'll go ahead and use that term, and I beg you not to be offended. I was not saying anything insulting there. That's just the correct term. So that is something that you want to consider here, and you want to consider, again, the narrator's perspective as she's telling the story, and that you can kind of figure out some of the things that she's talking about that even she doesn't completely understand. The other thing is this is told as an epistolary. What that means generally is told in the form of letters, but that can also apply to a diary, that can apply to news clippings. I added the definition to your list of literary terms, and you can see some other examples of ways in which that we do that. One of the most famous is a novel that was turned into a movie that was very successful, The Color Purple, which was originally written by Alice Walker, and while you can't tell in the movie, it was written as a series of letters to another woman. A modern example of that would be The Perks of Being a Wallflower, and from the movie you can kind of tell it was originally written as letters, and the book itself, which is one of the rare instances where I found that the movie is better than the book, And again, I had a professor in graduate school who would yell at us for saying the movie was better than the book because they're two different forms of media. But sorry, Perks of Being a Wallflower, the movie is a lot better, in my opinion, than the book. But anyway, this is an epistolary. It is, even though it's not letters, it is a diary that she's writing, or whatever you want to call it. She's just sort of writing to herself. Now, I suggest that you read in your textbook I think it comes after the short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, which is an essay by Charlotte Perkins Gilman called Why I Wrote the Yellow Wallpaper. And it addresses, again, the issues that she was having with depression, postpartum depression specifically, and why she wrote it. And it did have a huge effect. And that's what we see here. We see a woman who has been moved to the country with her husband, who's a doctor, for rest and relaxation. And, you know, this, let's go to the room that she's in. I'm kind of skipping around on my notes a little bit, but the room that she's in, if you read between the lines, and again, this is one of the things with something being in first person or something being an epistolary, is hopefully you realize that the room that she's in, she thinks is a nursery, but as you read, based on, you know, the bars on the window and the way the bed is nailed to the ground and all of that other kind of thing, this is a room for an insane person. Now, while, you know, this entire property could have been an insane asylum at some point, or just the room was designed for an insane person, the debate there is up in the air. The point is the treatment here. What is the treatment? She clearly has postpartum depression, which is very, very common. I've seen it in my own family after someone gave birth. And the way in which we handled that at the time was to not let the woman do anything. And so, again, just sit there and recover, which is the worst thing that you can do. Keeping busy, we know, will help people get over that. Putting someone alone in a room, not letting them write or do anything, only really adds to the problem of what happens. And so the other thing too, again, I'm going to kind of go into women's mental health and health in general here. I watched an interesting documentary or some sort of television segment the other day on heart attacks in women. And because of the hormones and everything that goes on with women that men don't have, as far as menopause, PMS, those kinds of things. Again, it's awkward being a male talking about these, but because of those, we tend to study men when we study medical things. And so the doctor who was being interviewed heavily for this documentary was a research doctor in the field of heart attacks, and she was talking about how she discovered that when she was doing research, she only did research on men because that's what she was always taught, and that's what she believed. Again, she figured when you add women into the circumstance, other things can be attributed to quote-unquote women problems. And so she started studying the effects and heart attacks, symptoms, and causes and all of that on women, and discovered that they were very, very different from what we expect from men. And so hopefully this will make a huge movement into modern medicine. At the time, again, there was no real application to mental health and understanding that. In fact, the term hysterectomy, when we say hysterical, we mean funny now a lot of times, but when we say someone is, has hysterics, it meant, overreacted. And that term is actually very closely tied root to the term hysterectomy, which is the removal of the womb and all the other reproductive parts, or some thereof, of women. And that actually dates back before Christ. The thought was, the theory was, women could have this wandering womb, which would move around the body and could cause other physical issues, other sicknesses, and even mental health issues, because it would move into the brain, was the theory. And so by having hysterectomy and removing it, it would stop these problems. Now, what's interesting is, because there are a lot of problems directly related to the female reproductive system and that kind of stuff, sometimes it solved the problem, so it seemed to back what they needed to say, but we didn't realize till years later that that was not the issue, and that it could be treated in less brutal, again, if you were given a hysterectomy before Christ, you would probably die of sepsis in the process. So it was a very, very dangerous operation. Let's see, I'm really being all over the place in this, but as far as the story goes, we see that, just this progression. It's pretty simple. It's a woman who's forced to get over postpartum depression in a very unhealthy way and becomes more and more insane. Now, one of the things I focus on when I teach this that I don't really see in a lot of writings and other things is the discussion of it happening with other objects when she was a child, which no one really talks about in critics and other things that I've read on this story, which leads you to believe that, remember she says something about, knobs and chairs and things talking to her when she was a child, which leads you to believe the mental illness, to a lesser extent, probably predated this postpartum depression. And we know that a lot of times women who have mental illnesses before, mild mental illnesses before giving birth, have them to a much more extreme level, have postpartum depression worse. Again, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not going to stand by that, but based on my experience, that's the case. So pretty much she's in a room, she's miserable, she's writing things, and again, the woman trapped behind the wallpaper, of course, becomes her, but is also a reflection of women in general trying to escape this very brutal world, and then world in which women are treated. We end with something that really kind of interests me, and I want you to think about as you're reading. And none of the critics that I looked at address it. They just sort of said John, the husband, comes in, passes out on the floor, and she sort of walks over him. But the wording of it is sort of that she walks over him for eternity. And to me, that leaves a lot of questions open. Is he dead? Is she dead? What has happened at that ending? So I really, if you're questioning it, really curious on what your thoughts are on the ending of the story. But again, when it comes to this story, it's really about mental health, postpartum depression, and the impact that Charlotte Perkins Gilman made on mental health in general. That's it. I'll talk to you next week.